Okay, welcome to the first of our video lessons, and this is section 5.1 on ratios and percents. And the idea here is that you can watch this video. This is your homework, and at any time you can always stop it and rewind. If there's something that didn't make sense to you, you can look at it again. You can stop it and work through a problem and try to figure it out, but yet you can progress at your own rate. So some of you who are a little quicker than others can move through this fairly quickly. The idea is that we will keep these fairly short. They'll probably be about 10 minutes long, and then hopefully you can come to class the next day and work through those problems and kind of see what's going on there and hopefully understand. All right, so we're talking about percents. And understand that anytime that we're talking about percents, we're always talking about the comparison of the number out of 100. So we always want to get it into a rate of a number out of 100. So if we're talking about 27 out of 100, we can say that is 27%. So that's what we're trying to figure out. So 27 out of 100 gives me 27%. We are on page 206, and it would be good if you followed along in your book so that you can work through the problems with me and you kind of see what's going on here. So turn in your book to page 206 as we work through this. Alright, so if you look at the example, it says we want to write these ratios as percent. In number 1, according to the 2000 U.S. Census, 22 out of every 100 people living in West Virginia were younger than 18. So we've got our 22 out of 100, we know what that is, and now all we need to do is figure out percent. Well, anytime we have it out of 100, that is our percent, so this one is 22%. The second one says, at a recent triathlon, 180 women competed for every 100 women who competed 10 years earlier. Now, write this exactly the way it says it. We've got 180 out of 100, and notice that our 180, that's bigger than 100. It is possible to have numbers that are greater than 100 and percents that are greater than 100. That is not uncommon. It just simply means that you're getting larger than you had before. So anytime you have a over 100% number, it just means you have greater than what you had prior to that, or in this case, greater than 100. So this would simply be 180%. And yes, that is perfectly fine. All right, why don't you guys stop this video, take a minute or two to do the two problems, A and B, at least write those out, so you know what you're doing, and we'll come back to that as soon as you're done with those. Okay, so if we look at those examples, it says during his baseball career, Babe Ruth had a base hit about 34 out of 100 times, so 34 out of 100, and of course that is 34%. And the other one, in a recent year, 41.5 out of 100 households in the United States had access to the internet. 41.5 out of 100. So 41.5%, and here you can see we have a decimal, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can have decimals or fractions of a percent all the time. All right, so moving on, let's go to the next example here. And here we're talking about ones that aren't as simple. They're not just directly out of 100. And so, for instance, it says about 1 out of every 5 luxury cars manufactured in the United States is white. So we're saying 1 out of 5, and we need to figure out what that is. Now, let's just take a look, and I'm going to put up a grid here, and I've got a grid of 10 by 10, and so obviously there's 100 squares here. But let's divide that into 5 equal parts for this example so we can just understand what we're doing. So we'll divide it right down here. There's 2, there's 3, there's 4, and then the last one is 5. And so what they're saying is if I have 1 out of every 5, that means I've got all this here. There's my 1 out of 5. And what we want to do is figure out, well, what percent is that? So if you were to sit and count those, obviously you can see that there are 20 boxes that are filled out of my 100 grid. And so we know that this is going to be 20 out of 100 or 20%. Now, you obviously do not have to draw all that out every time, but you need to understand how you're going to do that. So, for instance, we have 1 out of 5, and we want to figure out what that is out of 100. That's the problem that I'm trying to do. And this should look a lot like ratios that we did in the last chapter, so this should be pretty easy. And if we cross multiply, we can say 5 times x equals 1 times 100, which of course is 100. So 5x equals 100. To solve for x, divide both sides by 5. X equals 20. So my answer is 20%. Now it's important that we understand that we're trying to find percents. So the answer is not 20, the answer is 20%. So make sure that you include that percent sign as you're working through this. All right, let's take a look at another problem here. And on the second one, it says 1 out of 200 of travelers, about 1/200th of travelers use scheduled buses. So once again, let's go back to our grid. And this grid is a 100 square grid. So if we wanted 1 out of 200, we'd have to divide all of these in half. And I'm not going to divide all of them, but let's just do one. And what we're talking about is this many, this much right there. And obviously, if I divided all of those in half, I would have 200. Here would be my 1 out of 200. And when we're talking about percents, of course, we're talking about it in terms of 100. So I've got that right now in my grid. I've got 100 squares, and half of one is filled. So my percent is 0.5, or my ratio is 0.5 out of 100. Therefore, my percent is 0.5%. So I have less than 1%. 1% would mean I'd have one block filled in completely. I have less than that. And I can do the same thing that we did before. I can say, well, if I have 1 out of 200, what is that in terms of 100? So x over 100. And I can solve that same problem. I'm going to get 200 times x equals 100 times 1, or 100. Divide both sides by 200 to get rid of that. And this cancels here. I get x equals 0.5. And because we're doing it in terms of percents and 100, this is not just 0.5, but it is 0.5% for my answer. Okay, so why don't you once again stop the video and work through those two problems there. That shouldn't take you too long. Work through problems C and D on page 207. And when you get those done, then start the video again and we'll go over those. Okay, so if you look at problem C, it says in Finland, 3 out of 5 people have cell phones. But of course, we want it in terms of a percent, so we're always trying to get it out of 100. Trying to find what that is right there. And so 3 times 100 is going to equal 5 times x, because, you know, of course, we're talking about our cross-multiplying things. We know those are always equal. So 5x equals 300. Then to solve for x, divide both sides by 5. X equals 60. So my answer is 60% is the amount of people that use cell phones over in Finland. I would think that is probably higher here. And of course, maybe it's higher there now too. This book is probably a little bit old. Okay, the next problem. Let's go to a clean screen. The next problem, we've got about 1/4 of the mammals in the world are bats. So we're trying to figure out what percent is 1/4. Now, some of you may just be able to do that in your head. You might be familiar with that one. And you know, the idea when we did all those fractions and things was to actually start to memorize those. so that we can use them. But if not, here's how you're going to do that. You're going to cross multiply. You're going to say 4x equals 100, dividing by 4, both sides. You get x equals 25, so 25% is my answer for this particular problem. Okay, let's move on. One last section here. Let's work a little bit the other way. We want to write percents now as fractions. So we've got the graph, and we've got a circle graph that shows that approximately 30% of the trash is paper. You know, about 24% is plastic. This is yard waste, about 11%, and other trash, about 35%. And what we want to do is figure out, well, instead of percents, let's put them in terms of fractions. So let's say we're talking about paper, and so we know that paper is 30%. Well, we know that if it's 30%, it is 30 out of 100. And what we want to do now is simplify that down to the lowest fraction that we can get it. Well, looks like we can divide 10 out of both. So dividing 10 is like getting rid of a 0 on both sides. So we end up with 3/10. So this is our paper one. And let's do plastic. If we were looking at plastic, this was a little bit harder. We have 24 out of 100. And if we look at that and we say, well, we could certainly take a 2 out, that's pretty easy, but we can probably go a little bit bigger. I think we can probably take a 4 out of both sides. So if we divide that by 4, we get 6. Divide 100 by 4, we get 25. So 6/25 would be my fraction, and that would be the answer that I have here. Okay, so what I want you to do, once again, is stop the video, and you work on a number or letter E and F on the bottom of page 207. So E and F. Okay, so if we look at that one, yard waste was 11%. That would be 11 out of 100. And if we try to figure out anything that goes into 11 out of 100, there isn't anything. 11 is a prime number, and 11 doesn't go into 100, so we can't reduce it down. So that is my answer right there, just 11 out of 100. The other one, we can reduce down a little bit. We've got 35%, so we know that's 30. Let's try writing that correctly. 35 out of 100. And then if we look at that, we can probably take a 5 out of both. So if we divide this by 5, we get 7. And if we divide 20 or 100 by 5, we get 20. And so there's my fraction, 7 out of 20. Okay, so hopefully you are ready now that you could do the exercises on 5.1. And if there's something that you don't understand, remember you can always run back and watch this video again and watch it until it makes sense to you. That's the whole idea of this, is it gives you that opportunity to do that. So hopefully this has worked out for you and you like that.